Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for the Sierra Club New York City Group Sustainability Series webinar in collaboration with the Sierra Club Atlantic Chapter Equity, Consumption, and Environment Committee. Kathy Schwartz, Chair. My name is Catherine Skopik. I'm Chair of the New York City Group and its Sustainability Series. You may know that Sierra Club is the largest, oldest grassroots environmental organization in the United States. We work to protect and preserve the natural environment. One of our most popular programs is ICO, Inspiring Connections Outdoors, where we enable and encourage people of all ages to get outdoors, enjoy it, learn about it, and appreciate this wondrous planet. And now I introduce to you the chair of the Equity, Consumption, Environment Committee and the organizer of this event, Kathy Schwartz. Kathy?
Hi, everybody, and thank you for attending our important program tonight. And my name is Kathy Schwartz, and this is going to be an incredible evening we're going to have. We're going to cover some of the biggest causes of the changing climate. Some of these causes are generally overlooked and have even been deliberately suppressed because they are more inconvenient truths than the changing climate itself. But we must confront these issues and their vested interests head on from multiple angles. The unregulated industrialization of our natural world, the extraction of natural resources, such as fossil fuels and minerals, the growing population of people consuming these resources, and the growing militarization that results when there is more and more competition for the fewer and fewer natural resources, which we are sadly watching being played out in the world today. It is surely complex and will require changes that are political and personal if we can have any hope of resolving these issues we face. Our esteemed speakers will shed some light on these often hidden causes of the changing climate and hopefully offer some suggestions of actions we can take. We are so honored to have the following speakers: Neta, that was my congressperson, sorry. Neta Crawford, J.B. McKinnon, and Daniel Wildcat. And we will start with Neta Crawford, and I will introduce her right now. Neta Crawford is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University and co-director of the Costs of War project, which is based at Boston, at Brown University. She is the author of several books, including The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, which is forthcoming from MIT Press. We will be looking forward to reading that important book. In July, she will become the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at Oxford University. And it is my honor to welcome Neta Crawford as our first speaker. Thank you.
And while Neta is getting that set up, I would just like to call to your attention the colors I'm wearing today, and you know what they're in honor of, as we're all thinking about the people of Ukraine. And here, unfortunately, the militarism has raised its ugly head in a very real and upsetting way. So we keep these people in our hearts and minds. And I'd also like to add, well, I think Neta's ready. I just wanted to say that the military is the largest polluter and also the largest consumer of fossil fuels. Nita, you're ready, right?
I'm ready. I hope I'm ready. So thank you very much. And let me just ask, what do you see on your screens?
It's the thumbnails are going horizontally along the bottom. And then we
All
have
right.
the
I'm
middle.
giving up on this sharing. So listen, what you're going to see on the bottom, pay no attention to the slides behind the curtain. Don't worry about it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I have a lot to say today, and I only have a few minutes. So what I want to do is just tell you that this is a great opportunity to speak to you at this moment in time where we're at a transition or a moment of crisis or opportunity, depending on how you look at it. With the war in Ukraine, we see that the United States military is going to get more money than it has asked for from Congress, and there's a tremendous militarization going on in Europe as well in response to the Russian aggression. The Russian aggression is wrong. I don't want to suggest anything other than that, but we have to ask ourselves if we need to really move away from war as an institution, if we can, and work much more on arms control, disarmament, and non-military responses. But that is not my talk today. What I want to do is give you a sense of military emissions and climate change. And what we have here are my themes: war as a driver of emissions and industrialization, the US military's role in climate science and climate change negotiations. The third theme is the military and the military industrial emissions for the last 45 years. How the military thinks about climate change, securitization, and the militarization of climate change. Resilience and adaptation versus mitigation, and windows of opportunity, which I've just alluded to. So what I want to do is really just focus a bit on war as a driver of emissions and industrialization historically. And so here you see some quotes from people at the turn of the last century, where they saw that coal was the lifeblood of the military, and it had been the lifeblood since the middle of the 19th century. So here's Captain Asa Walker, and coal is the lifeblood of the Navy in particular at this point, talking about the mobility that is derived from fossil fuels. And then Alfred T. Mahon, who is considered by many the architect of the modern Navy, talks about fuel standing first in importance of the resources necessary to a fleet. Without ammunition, a ship may run away, hoping to fight another day, but without fuel, she can neither run nor reach her station, nor remain on it if remote, nor fight. So he's articulating what becomes the rationale for the United States to get bases all over the world. And how does this happen? How do we go from this moment from the moment of sail, which you see in the upper left there, where we begin when the United States is not even yet born. Everyone is using sail. We have sail through the early 19th century. Then coal begins to power the fleet, and the United States begins to get coaling stations in order to make sure that its Navy has places to refuel. And what we see, which was the cover image of my presentation on the lower left, is the Great White Fleet of 1907, 1908, which is signaling President Roosevelt's entry onto the world stage as the United States is a great power. And here, the Great White Fleet is actually powered by bituminous coal, and it is not so white after all. And what you see on the lower right is the coaling stations for the British in the 19th century and early 20th century, which the United States has to use until it gets its own coaling stations. In the world wars, it was believed that fuel was essential. Lord Curzon said, of course, the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil. It was actually mostly coal, but you get the point. And you see in World War II, you see that the object was to prevent the other side from having fuel. So we bombed German and Italian and Japanese fuel depots. And here you see on the left an image of the bombing of a Romanian oil refinery. Of course, the Ukrainians have targeted and successfully bombed a Russian fuel depot in this current war. You see here an image of the United States understanding of how to target petroleum, the considerations that would go into that. And in this slide, you see the consequences of attacking oil fields, which is, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. The same with oil depots. So my point here is that since the 19th century, we've been in a deep cycle of availability of fossil fuels, and here I'm focused on oil, increased use, the growth of the infrastructure to support that fuel use, the use of military strategy to both maintain supply for the industries as well as to maintain supply for military use, then the fear of threats to oil or gas or coal supplies. And then you see that insecurity translating into this next row, moving from right to left, the attempt to decrease insecurity, control price, and control access and supply. Then what happens in this deep cycle is you increase military spending, arms purchases, and the presence of the great power in oil and gas producing regions, and the protection of the lines of communication between those fuel depots and fuel sources and the great power, in this case, the United States. But you're depending on oil-rich states, which may or may not be stable. Now, this leads to increased fuel consumption. So the need to maintain supply leads to increased fuel consumption by the military. And the last part is of this slide here is there are very few times when we've seen attempts to break this cycle, this deep cycle of fossil fuel dependency, by decreasing dependence on fossil fuels, by diversifying or developing alternative fuel technologies. We're at such a moment now when there is discussion about doing just that. So now I want to talk a little bit about why the United States is the largest the United States military is the largest fuel consumer, single institutional fuel consumer in the world, and certainly the largest energy consumer in the United States, single energy consumer, that is, because we're everywhere all the time. And these are some of our bases, hundreds of them, and they all have the potential and actuality of being supplied by the Defense Logistics Agency. They say their footprint is global, and it is truly global. And because we're at war in many regions of the world, and either a hot war, or we're engaged in military exercises, or our troops, US troops, are engaged in supporting or training others to fight, this is a demand for fuel that remains relatively constant. And we'll talk a little bit more about that demand. But now I want to just switch and talk about the US military's role in climate science and climate change negotiations. The US military funded climate change science from the 1950s through the present, and some of the major work, the work by Revell and others, which show the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and warming, comes from funding by the Navy. And then, of course, the United States military was against inclusion of the military emissions in the Kyoto Protocol counting rules. And here is a quote, and it's very long, I won't read it, but it explains how the US chief negotiator, Stuart Eisenstadt, saw what happened at Kyoto. He says that basically the military got what it wanted. The parties took a decision to exempt overseas military activities from emissions targets. And these are the bunker fuel emissions. And it's basically the same today. This is really unchanged, even though there's been some wiggling around the edges. Now, here is the major punchline for this present part of the presentation. US military emissions in 1975 were about 100 million metric tons annually, 1975, and then they've declined. But what I'm trying to show you with the slide here is that military emissions decline when the United States is at peace, or when something else is going on, increased efficiencies. Okay, so but the big decline in emissions is post 1991, post the end of the Cold War. And as the United States has drawn down its forces in Afghanistan and Iraq through 2019, in this slide, you see emissions are going down. The red dashed line in the middle is DoD operational emissions, that is the war stuff. And then the dotted line are installations. And here's a little focus on a little closer period. You see, again, the same thing that I'm talking about, periods of peace, the decline. But the US military emissions, and here's a figure from 2017 from Forbes, are still as large in 2017 as many countries. In fact, many countries combined, and you can see the comparison here. Where is all this energy used? The purple, the outer rings, are for aircraft. Much of it is for aircraft, and some of it is, and this is 2014, for the different commands, but the operational use is mostly for, the majority of it's for aircraft. Here, I'm going to highlight the military industrial emissions of the top three. And what you see is fluctuation between 2010 and 2019 in the amount of emissions that they've reported, scope 1 and scope 2, and you see some decline in overall emissions as they are greening. Here we see, if you just look at the first two, you see Lockheed Martin and Boeing's emissions in 2019, but this column right in the middle, where I say portion of company revenue from arms sales, is important. You see that some companies are much more dependent on the military as a client than others. And the least dependent is General Electric, of the top producers of military industrial equipment. Okay, so how does the military think about climate change? I'm going to argue three things. They get it. They're busy cataloging the impact on installations and operations, and they're engaged in securitization. I'll explain what I mean by that. How do they get it? They get that the greater the warming, the greater the impacts on human security. And here's from the National Intelligence Estimate last fall. We see that they're concerned about heat, precipitation, drought, sea level rise, Arctic ice melt, which they began to be concerned about in the 1950s, when, again, Ravel and others were identifying the fact that the Arctic would be more open. And they talked about in the 1950s and the 1960s the fact that there might be increased competition within the Soviet Union over access to resources in the Arctic. I won't go through the rest of this, but one of the things that they've really been talking about quite consistently for the last decade and more is how they're worried about impacts on installations, flooding for the most part, but also heat. And they're worried about institutional overwhelm, responding to crises as they occur, having to respond to fires and to hurricanes and to flooding. And here you see damage at Tyndall Air Force Base. And for a time, there was a question about whether or not they'd even repair Tyndall because it is so vulnerable and there was so much destruction there. Here's another major base in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia, which is an atoll, which is vulnerable to sea level rise. and the military is trying to make it less vulnerable. The other way they think about it is impacting stability where troops are operating. And this begins to be part of the operational concern, but the major operational concern is that climate change war may be coming to a neighborhood near you. That is, it's, as Locklear said, Admiral Locklear said in 2013, it's probably the most likely thing that's going to happen that will cripple the security environment, probably more likely than other scenarios. And he means war with China than we often talk about. So the current thinking is that climate change will increase risks in various regions. And here's a diagram from the Department of Defense climate risk analysis from last fall. And what you see here is they're focusing on resources and conflict. The fists together are the areas where they think conflict may be likely. And you see that they see conflict likely in much of the Southern Hemisphere. As here is another way they look at it. This document, again from the US government, shows that they believe that Central Africa is going to be a hotspot, a potential region, as well as South Asia, where conflict may be coming, and especially migration, but the potential for these countries to face governmental stressors that lead to disintegration of their capacities to respond to climate emergencies, and then hence migration and so on. So, but you already know that most of the regions that they've identified have not been contributors to emissions, cumulative emissions. In fact, the big story here is we've caused the problem that we expect others to face. So what I'm suggesting here, and quoting from the Department of Homeland Security, is that they are really concerned about how climate change will make the world much more insecure. That's what I mean by securitization. Securitization is the process where you take an issue, which is not necessarily a securities concern, a military concern, and turn it into a national or international security concern. And just let me read one sentence here. The corrosive impact of these trends, that is climate change, will make nations increasingly vulnerable to domestic instability with sweeping implications for regional and border security and core national security interests. Simultaneously, revisionist nations will seek to exploit climate change-induced instability to erode the rules-based order that is central to the security and prosperity of the United States and its allies. Revisionist nations, and by this they mean Russia and China. Okay, so we're at a moment where we have a choice. The military is choosing to focus on resilience and adaptation, not on emissions reduction. When you look at their documents, and they're greening themselves. This is an image of the Great Green Fleet, which runs partly on biofuels. Of course, the aircraft carrier on the top upper left there is nuclear powered. And here we see lots of beautiful imagery of how they're enhancing their green image. But if you look to what they're actually doing and that's the table I've got on the far right, they're really not actually producing a lot of renewable energy that they're using. So I think there's a lot of good advertisement here, but less is occurring than we'd like. So I'll finish by suggesting that that this is a moment of opportunity, and the opportunities are these. One could either continue to securitize, which has the effect, I think, of delaying the reductions in military emissions that are essential, and then delaying the reductions in military industrial emissions. And you also have the opportunity, some will argue, to use the military as a way to promote green technology. I think that's inefficient, but that is another opportunity. But we're at this choice point, and I think it's essential that organizations like Sierra Club are talking about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neta. That was very, very interesting. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you too later on. But now I would like to introduce J.B. McKinnon. And he is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, National Geographic, and The Atlantic, as well as the Best American Science and Nature Writing anthologies. He is an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of British Columbia. Some of his earlier works are I'm having a hard time reading this. The Choice and Future World, a bestseller about rewilding the natural world, and The 100-Mile Diet. But his latest book, which is what he's going to concentrate on tonight, is The Day the World Stops Shopping. And if I can hold it up, maybe you can see it. It is a thought experiment that imagines what would happen to our economies, our products, our planet, and ourselves if we committed to consuming far fewer of the Earth's resources. He will speak tonight mostly about this book, which I highly recommend. But we can hear from him directly. Thank you, Professor McKinnon.
Well, thanks so much, Kathy, and thank you to the Sierra Club of New York for inviting me to speak on this subject. I guess I'll start by talking about how it is I ended up writing a book about what would happen if we stopped consuming so much, stopped shopping. And the origin of this project was that I had been an environmental writer and journalist for about 20 years now. And I began to realize over time that it didn't really matter what subject I was writing about, what environmental challenge I was looking at. If I looked at the root cause of that problem, it was almost always the case that our consumption of goods, services, and experiences was either the root cause of that problem, the primary root cause, or was one of the primary drivers of that problem. So I began two things struck me about that. One was that it seemed really essential that we should be talking about root causes of these problems. The other aspect that I thought was really important is that we didn't seem to be talking about consumption as an environmental problem. And we hadn't done so for about 20 or more years. So when I began to look at this, one of the first reports that really stood out to me was from a UN panel that studies global natural resources. So we all know, we hear a lot about this UN panel that studies climate change and climate emissions. There's also a panel that studies global natural resource use. And in 2019, that panel issued a report that said that sometime around the year 2000, overconsumption actually surpassed overpopulation as the biggest driver of our global environmental challenges. So in other words, how much each one of us consumes now matters more than how many of us there are on the planet. And if you're having trouble picturing how that might work, I've got a statistic that helps explain it. So the average person in one of the world's richer countries right now consumes about 13 times as many resources through their consumption as the average person in a poorer country does around the world. So that means if you are part of a family, if you have a family of 4 in a nation like the United States or any other wealthy nation, then it's as though you have a family of 52 in a poorer nation. And of course, even in much poorer nations, there are very few families with 52 members. So even though people in wealthier countries have been having fewer children, we're making up for that and more through our consumption. Now, if we're consuming too much, there's an obvious solution, which would be to reduce our consumption. Buy fewer clothes, travel less often, and so on. And we know that that is, in fact, very effective. And we know this from the pandemic. So if you picture the famous chart of carbon emissions, the hockey stick chart, we know that emissions have been gradually increasing since the start of the 20th century. And then after World War II, they shot up, really started to skyrocket quite dramatically. But if you look very closely at the end of the hockey stick where the emissions are rising so sharply, there are a few mysterious points where it dips and where emissions actually decline. The first of those happened in 1930, which of course was the Great Depression. There's another sharp drop during World War II. There were drops during the recessions in the 1980s and the early 1990s, the recession in 2008. And of course, we will all remember that there was the sharpest and deepest drop in emissions ever recorded at the outset of the global pandemic in 2020. So all of these events have a couple of things in common. One thing they have in common is that in all of those events, large numbers of people stopped consuming as much as they traditionally have. And it turns out that we are able to make really big reductions in carbon emissions very quickly, essentially overnight, if we simply turn down the level of our consumption. It's an incredibly effective way to reduce emissions. But all of those events also have something else in common, which is that they are all economic disasters. Tens of thousands of people lost their livelihoods in most of those situations, recessions, depressions, the pandemic. In fact, economists actually refer to circumstances like these as consumption disasters. So when we reduce our consumption, it is considered a form of disaster. So in the book, I call this the consumer dilemma, because we have a planet that seems to need us to stop consuming so much, and we have an economy that requires us to keep consuming, and in fact, to consume more and more every year. We've addressed this so far over the last 20 years, really. We've taken one approach that we think will allow us to sort of solve or perhaps work around this dilemma, and that's the approach that I call green consumerism. So for the past 20 years, rather than working towards reducing our consumption, we have worked towards reducing the impacts of our consumption. We do that through things like renewable energy, energy efficiency, making products recyclable or biodegradable, making products circular in terms of kind of cradle to grave type processes. Through all of these methods, we've been trying to make our consumption green. 20 years into this experiment, we can see that greening consumerism has proved to be very, very difficult. We have seen truly impressive improvements in energy efficiency and tremendous gains in the production of things like solar power, wind power, and other renewable sources of energy. Nearly everything we do and nearly everything we use is more energy efficient, more sustainable than it was in the year 2000. And yet, we're consuming more of nearly every resource on Earth than we were in the year 2000, from gravel to gold to timber to oil. So the most spectacular failure, perhaps, in this effort to decouple consumption from its environmental consequences is that we have yet to see a single year in which global carbon emissions actually dropped as a result of green tech and clean energy and these efforts to green consumer culture. It's still the case that the only times in history that carbon emissions have dropped at a global scale have come during these recessions, depressions, wars, and so on, when the world effectively stops shopping. So our efforts to green our consumer appetite simply have not been able to keep up with how quickly that appetite is growing. But this takes us back to that same question. Is there then a way to reduce consumption without triggering the collapse of civilization? And this is what I explore in all kinds of different ways in my book, looking at how we might use time differently, what kind of business models we might use, what kind of economic theories we might bring to bear. And I'm not going to go through all of those things, but I'll look at a couple of them. One is how products might be different in a world that had reduced its consumption. So we buy today twice as many articles of clothing as we did 20 years ago. And that, of course, sounds pretty bad, and it is pretty consequential. But a big part of the reason that we buy twice as many clothes is because they last half as long as they used to. Buttons fall off, colors fade, leggings get runs in them, seams pull apart. I mean, we're all familiar with this experience now of buying clothing that proves to be more or less disposable. And of course, this is very beneficial to clothing companies because then we have to purchase more clothes. So what I'm describing here is a system that's designed to encourage consumption. And I don't think we asked for this system. No one campaigned for or demanded that clothes be made more disposable than they were in the past. And in fact, I think many of us are frustrated by it. So here are some real world proposals for the kinds of things we could do to make clothes last as long as they did just 20 years ago. We could do things like require lifespan labeling on clothing. So we can make a value decision about how long we want our clothes to last, how much we want to pay up front for how long we want our clothes to last. We could make clothing companies responsible for the disposal of the clothing they produce. We could change taxes and subsidies so that the environmental costs of producing clothing are built into the price of those products, which would make products that were newly made far more expensive than, for example, secondhand clothing, and would make products that were more durable, more popular because of that increase in price. We could challenge lifestyle media to stop promoting trend-driven fashion. We could simply put pressure on companies to make their clothes last longer. And we're actually starting to see movement in this direction. So we have companies like Patagonia, which is moving towards a model of selling fewer new things, recapturing their used clothing, and making a bigger part of their business model the resale of their own clothes, and as well as repairing and altering clothing. So they have a slogan now, shop less, demand more. Last spring, Levi's started moving in this direction. So I interviewed the then brand president, Jen Say, and she told me a little bit about their thinking on this. So she said for quite a while, the company thought it was good enough really just to try to make the production of their products more sustainable in various ways. And then she said this. She said, as we started studying this even more, we realized that simply consuming less has the greatest impact. It's great to convince consumers to buy thoughtfully, but really the biggest impact we can have is to convince them to buy less. And that's kind of a radical notion when you think that as the marketing leader, my job is to get people to buy more. So you can see this shift in thinking and how dramatic a shift in thinking it is that's starting to happen in business as they move towards what's sometimes called the buy less, buy better model, or the model of fewer, better things. So that's just one of the ways we can transform the actual system that is currently constantly encouraging us to consume. And I'll talk about one more thing that might change in a world that's slowed its shopping, and that would be us. So this was a question that I was actually trying to explore just as the pandemic struck, and I was having a conversation with a psychologist named Tim Kasser, who might be, is probably the premier psychologist studying materialism on the planet today. And when I say materialism, you might picture a classic materialist, someone who's obsessed with things and money and always showing off their new car and showing off their latest fantastic trip on Instagram, these sorts of things that we associate with classic materialism. Psychologists see the term materialism more broadly. They define materialism as just a set of values and beliefs that focus on the importance of income, possessions, and social status. So you can see that by that definition, we're all part of a culture that is deeply materialist, a culture that's deeply focused on income, possessions, and social status. So materialism revolves around what they call extrinsic values. It involves external approval. So being fashionable, for example, is a extrinsic value. You may take pleasure in your good taste in clothing, but it really takes, you have to be acknowledged by other people as a fashionable person in order to be considered fashionable. The opposite of extrinsic values is intrinsic values. And these are things that are internally satisfying. They don't require external approval. So, for example, having a close-knit group of friends is intrinsically valuable. We don't need people to admire us for a close-knit group of friends. Having a close-knit group of friends is simply inherently satisfying to us. Other examples of intrinsic values are things like taking care of your health, developing an authentic identity, mastering new skills, connecting with nature, giving back to your community, and engaging with issues larger than yourself, like the environment or social causes. So I was talking to Tim Kasser about this on the phone, and I said, well, if we turned away from materialistic values, how long would it take us to turn towards these more intrinsically satisfying values? And Tim said, well, I don't know. There's not really any research on that specific question. We were having that conversation on January 30th, 2020. So later that same day, the World Health Organization announced that the coronavirus had become a global health emergency. And within a couple of weeks, much of the world was literally locked out of the consumer economy. And really interesting things started to happen. I mean, of course, it was a terrible tragedy that was playing out, but I'm sure you will remember some of the other major trends of that time as well. The news media was reporting what they called an epidemic of kindness. There was a huge wave of people reaching out to friends and family, often including people that they hadn't reached out to for years. There was the famous trend towards baking sourdough bread loaves, which is mastering a new skill, intrinsically satisfying. People were pursuing physical fitness within their homes. They were getting back in touch with nature through a lot of people through bird watching. And of course, there was this sudden and very striking surge of interest in social justice movements like Black Lives Matter. So, as you're probably realizing, these are exactly the kinds of things that psychological research predicted we would turn towards if we turned our backs on materialism and consumerism. And they're also exactly the kinds of things that people who deliberately reduce their consumption turn towards in order to make meaning in their lives, people who practice things like voluntary simplicity. So in the pandemic, we saw that people could make a shift towards this other set of values, and they could make that shift very quickly and very successfully. Now, we all know it didn't last. We all know that the consumer economy and consumer culture reorganized itself and adapted and found ways to reach us in our homes and sort of bring us back into what we knew best, which is participating in a consumer culture. But there was this glimpse into some of what a world without shopping might look like. So the good news is that we're finally are actually starting to talk about consumerism as an environmental problem again. As I said, the last time this happened was in the 1990s with the voluntary simplicity and downshifting movements. That was the last time there was a major pulse of interest in this particular topic. We see Gen Z now moving towards things like thrifting and pushing back against consumerism. We are not yet, I don't think, at the point where this movement has the power to really drive the big changes that are necessary in the system. But we are at the point where conversations like this one tonight are really the most important thing we can be doing, kind of pulling consumption from the fringe of the conversation about sustainability to the center of the conversation about sustainability, because that's really where it needs to be. And that makes it such a pleasure to be a part of this conversation tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And his book is fantastic too. I recommend, not that everybody go out and buy some, but have your libraries buy it so that more people can read it and put it on display. So my camera just went off. Okay. So thank you so much. And also maybe let your Congress people know to buy this book too. Or to read this book. It's so important. It is so important. And next, our next speaker is Daniel Wildcat. He is a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. He teaches at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, and created the Haskell Environmental Research Study Center there. He is also author of several books, but the one he's going to speak of most is this one, if you can see that. It's called Red Alert: Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge. And it suggests the idea of indigenous ingenuity. And he calls it indigenuity. And it is it requires us to reduce the environmental damage of the Anthropocene. And he will also give us another value system like that Professor McKinnon was speaking of as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Wildcat. Take it away.
Song Lai, thank you so much for that introduction. Façon, Sangeli, Zoyaha, Yuchiha, Muskogee, Ashidane, Adene. Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Dan Wildcat, and I am a Yuchi member, a Zoyaha member of the Muskogee or Creek Nation of Oklahoma. And just let me say, it is just such an honor, and I'm humbled to be a part of a panel with Professor Crawford and Professor McKinnon. And I don't know if it was by design, but in many ways, I think what we're talking about is very complementary between the three of us. You know, I'm going to argue today that what we need is a climate change, a cultural climate change is what we need. I happen to think today that in the 21st century, some of the most important voices we're going to need to listen to are indigenous voices, people from around the world. indigenous voices, indigenous peoples who hold on to worldviews, value systems that are not responsible for the crises we now see around the world. You've all heard that apocryphal quote attributed to Einstein. There's no evidence Einstein ever said this, but someone wise did. And it's when Einstein was asked to give some insight on a difficult problem, his colleague came back the next day and said, well, what advice do you have? And Einstein allegedly said, remember, you can't fix problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. You can't blame the Lakota. You can't blame the Zoyaha. You can't blame the Haudenosaunee, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Apache Comanche. You can't blame them for the global crises we now see around us. So we've got a challenge when we want to address climate change. And really, Neta and JB have laid out so beautifully two of those major challenges. One are this penchant we have for overconsumption, what Thorsten Veblen called conspicuous consumption, and of course, Neta's analysis of this idea of the securitization of climate change, I think, is so powerful. And I think both of these issues they've raised really point out the systemic nature of what we're going to have to face and address. And so I think now's a good time to listen maybe to people who thought very differently about the world, our human place in it, and what our human responsibilities are in this life world. Nothing I'm going to say is original. I can't claim it mine. The advantage of being at Haskell Indian Nations University for over almost 4 decades now is that I've got to meet so many wise indigenous elders, knowledge holders, people who don't have PhD or EDD or, JD after their name, but they have deep knowledges about their relationship, their people's relationship to that part of the world where they live. And so I want to say that right off the bat. I'm just kind of reporting out tonight some lessons that have been gifted to me by very wise people. And the second thing I want to honor is, because we've sort of touched on it in the introduction tonight, all of us only have so much bandwidth. And one of the challenges we have in climate change, which is that kind of slow emergency, it's not like the horrible bombing and destruction we are seeing in the Ukraine. And yet we know in the long run, if left unattended, it could be just as consequential. And that's part of the challenge we have. I want to ask us all to be mindful that humans, we only have so much, bandwidth. And we are faced with all kinds of crises. Think of the political and governmental crises we have in the United States. Forget about the Ukraine. Let's think about the United States. Think about the crises we have, economic crises. I mean, people are concerned. Can they, pay their electric bill? Can they pay their rent? Can they afford to buy groceries? Inflation really hurts people, and often hurts people that are at the lower end of the socioeconomic, ranks of our society. And so, this is something that we have to recognize when we get frustrated maybe about some people not prioritizing climate change the way I myself and JB and Neta might want to. They're figuring out how they're going to put braces on their kids, pay the medical bill, pay the groceries, keep their lights on, and pay the rent. And I think those are real problems. Those are existential problems. And we have a lot of people in the world who their bandwidth is taken up with that every day. That said, what can we do to address this global threat that has emerged during the age of the Anthropocene? Well, let's start right there. The age of humans so far has not been real good for the plants, the animals, the land, the air, and the water on this planet. Sierra Club knows this as well as anyone. You members know that. This is one of our challenges. We are degrading, in some cases destroying the environments we depend on. It's insane. And yet we've created these systems that produce this. So I'm going to give you, I'm going to speak very honestly. It doesn't mean I'm right, as my good Hawaiian brother Merv Tano likes to say, you can honestly be wrong. It's all right to honestly be wrong. And he always reminds me, and sometimes, Dan, you're pretty good at that. But I'm going to speak honestly, because I'm going to speak to you as relatives. Because I know good relatives won't let me be confused, or if they've got something that you can enlighten me on and maybe help think about something more clearly, I welcome that, and I expect you to do that. You'll be a good relative to me, right? So I'm not worried about whether I've got it exactly right or anything. I'm just going to speak honestly, and I hope what I share is useful. So this is kind of the elevator speech version of deep discussions we could have about the crises. So that's the first thing. It's multiple crises, and they're all interrelated. They're not, you can't, that's the problem. They're entangled. Okay, our consumerism, the securitization, the militarization around climate change. They're related. Okay. And so I'm going to make 3 basic points and ask you to just think about, so we're going to do kind of a mental experience. And I hope that JB will have some good questions for me after this, and maybe Neta too, and some of you. Number 1, if we wanted to try a very radical change of how we understood our human place in the world, I would argue we all consider a good dose of indigenous realism. And in my Zoyaha traditions, humans aren't the only persons in the world. We honor plants and animals, the land, the air, and the water with personhood. They're not human persons, but they have power and they can use it. By considering plants, animals, the land, the air, and the water as relatives, we could step away from one of the key problems, one of the key systemic features of our dangerous worldview. And that would be the following: that within many tribal traditions, I'm not going to say all tribal traditions, but remember, I'm at an institution that serves every federally recognized tribe. I think the number is 575, 76 now, federally recognized indigenous peoples in Alaska and the contiguous 48 states. I'm not talking about Pacific Islanders in Hawaii or the American territories of the Pacific. I'm not even including them, or those relatives in Puerto Rico. I'm not including them. We're talking about those people who legally are defined as American Indians or Alaska Natives, those indigenous peoples. that when we think about them, one of the things that seems very widely shared in their worldview is this acknowledgement that we do not live in a world full of resources. We live in a world full of relatives. Think about that. Just for a moment. How would our conduct change if when we stepped outside our comfortable little interior spaces, those of us that are fortunate to maybe have those, that when we step outside those, we realize we are entering a community that we are a part of that involves plants, animals, the land, the air, and the water. I don't think that's romanticism. I call that indigenous realism. After all, what does modern evolutionary theory tell us? It tells us the same thing that the Lakota say in all of their prayers and invocations. They have a phrase, you'll always hear it when you go to the Northern Plains among those so-called Great Sioux nations, the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota speakers. And it sounds kind of like this. I can't always get rid of my Oklahoma twang. So no offense to my Lakota relatives who are listening. But what they say in their prayers goes like this. Matakiwa oyase. For all of my relations. I asked a Lakota student one time about that phrase, and you know what he did? He went to his dorm room and he came back to my office and he showed me that first picture of the planet Earth from outer space, and written across it in Lakota was Matakiwa oyase. He says, when we pray for all of our relatives on this Mother Earth. Modern evolutionary theory says we're all related. Modern ecology tells us about how we're all connected in these relationships, sometimes symbiotically productive, sometimes destructive relationships. But I think we would change our behavior radically if we understood we weren't living among resources, but living among relatives, because then we would get over these silly arguments about who owns what resource and who has a right to use that resource. And we might ask ourselves, how can I live respectfully with the plants, with the animals, with the land, the air, and the water? That's a good piece, I think, of indigenous wisdom. And many indigenous people around the world seem to hold this as a fundamental kind of first principle, that we live in a deeply relational reality. And I think we could benefit by taking seriously an examination of what it would mean if we started living our lives no longer in a world full of resources. By the way, resources for whom? Well, here we are at the touchstone of the Anthropocene. You know, us, of course. Well, I don't know in my family, but you don't treat your relatives like resources. If the only time you ever show up is when you want something, and they've got a long enough road to see you coming and you act that way, at a certain point, they'll start turning off the lights and locking the doors and acting like no one's at home. And what have we done as humankind? We've treated the planet as if it were an ATM machine where we're constantly taking stuff out of it, wealth. And we build systems of power about that. And we behave rather badly as humankind. I would much prefer to acknowledge I live in a world full of relatives and ask myself, how can I behave respectfully? That's point one. Point two would be this. This is the other consequence of this living among relatives. We are fixated in this society, particularly, on inalienable rights. Oh, we've just gone through a pandemic, and there are people, I live in the Midwest, where there are people who don't even believe they have a responsibility to wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic because you are violating their inalienable rights. Indigenous people respect rights and liberties as much as anyone. But we talk about, or we honor the fact that those rights and liberties are groundless and very shallow, unless they are connected, complementary to inalienable responsibilities. No. When we live in a world of resources, all we do is fight over who has the right to use that water, to use that land, to pollute that air, or who has to clean up that air. It's all about rights. If we lived among relatives, we would start asking ourselves, what are our human inalienable responsibilities to be good relatives to the balance of creation? I don't think, again, that's romanticism. That seems to be more consistent with modern science, evolution, and ecology than an old Newtonian clockwork world, a very machine-like world. And I think this would be a tremendous step forward. One, move from a worldview dominated with resources to starting to think more relationally about the world. The two dear friends of mine, the ecologist and environmental scientist Dennis Martinez, and then my late friend Steve Pavlik, who was a faculty member at Northwest Indian College, both talk about we live in a kin-centric world. We're really kin, not just among our human relations, but the biology of the planet. And we haven't been very good relatives. I think this is part of the cultural climate change we've got to foster. And how can we do it? Well, we get people out of doors and start recognizing the beauty that surrounds us. I'd be remiss, again, I've got one more major point I want to make, but before I get there, again, point one, move from a worldview dominated with resources to one full of relatives. And that brings point two, which means we can make complementary to inalienable liberties and rights the equally important inalienable, unalienable responsibilities we must have. And I think this is really, really crucial, because at the point where we are right now, we spend most of our time, and by the way, I think this is one of the key, now I want to kind of get Neta's comments later about this militarization and the securitization of climate change. You know, the bottom underlying, element of that is fear. We're afraid. We have a military because we're afraid of something. One of the last departments we created in the United States government in the wake of 9/11, again, a horrible catastrophe. But we created what? The Department of Homeland Security. Who are we afraid of? What are we afraid of? I hear people sometimes in environmental circles talk about food security. Well, who are we afraid of? What's going to take our food? We have created a world full of fear. And in indigenous traditions, I would put forward for a great many of our traditions, the natural world is not a place of fear. It's a place of beauty. It's a place of awesome power, and you are very respectful of that power, but that doesn't mean you fear it. Well, you don't fear it if you know it. So here's what I'd like to suggest as point 3. I think part of the problem we have, and I'd love to get JB's comments on this. I think part of the challenge we have today is that when many of us talk about climate change, people what they hear us saying is, oh, you're going to lose all of this great stuff and this material world you live in and all of that. And, you know, I think, you know, we're in a dominant culture where, you know, people like their things. But I think we can change that messaging to say, you know, and this is what we talk about in my classes. We talk about what we've lost in the world we live in today. And we talk about the fact that people complain, particularly in the wake of COVID, about depression, about isolation, about a loneliness. And this is one of the key things college students talk about today, how they want to be a part of a community, but they can't find a community to be a part of. They want to be related in meaningful relationships. And so what I would like to suggest is that, you know, we sort of walk away from these discussions about sustainability and start a discussion about promoting systems of life enhancement, not just human life, but all the life we participate in. Think of that as a new benchmark for progress. It's not our human comfort and capital gains. It's, at the end of the day, have I lived my life in such a way that I've been a respectful relative to the balance of creation I happen to share my life with in a particular place? And have I promoted systems of life enhancement? And here's the benefit. Those are systems of resilience. I call it resilience plus. It's just not going back to something. You know, material scientists call resilience a physical principle. When you put it on an I-beam, it can take a lot of pressure, it can bend, but then it can bend back, go back to what it was. I don't want to go back to what it was. I want to suggest we can live more rich, fuller human lives if we recognize this larger kinship system we are all a part of. And here's the advantage. We can step away, hopefully, from a world full of fear. And instead of a Department of Homeland Security, I'm advocating, let's create a Department of Homeland Maturity. Let's ask ourselves what we can do as mature human beings, responsible human beings, to be good kin to the balance of life we share the planet with, and quit acting like spoiled children who think it's all about me right now. I'll leave you with that, and if some of this has been useful, take it. If you find it disuseful and distasteful, I've only taken a little over 20 minutes of your time, but I really look forward to the discussion here. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. And I would like to suggest not only the Department of Homeland Maturity, but maybe the Department of Homeland Humility. But how do we get there?
Yeah.
Is the big question. And so I want to open this up to discussion and questions. And I see one question already. Let me see. There are several actually now. And Terry Sparr had a question. Catherine, can you make him, open his mic for him if he wants to ask it himself?
What is his name? Terry Sparr?
Yes.
Okay, I'll look for him on the list and
Right.
give
Yeah.
him more. Okay, I'm looking. And also, I think Daniel Wildcat asked a question of each of the speakers as well.
Right.
I don't see
I
Daniel.
can see Terry's question in the chat if you like.
Oh, yeah, please read it, because I don't see his name here. Go ahead.
Would you like me to read the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, it's quite long. It says, JB, if I buy fewer clothes or fly less, don't I receive an economic benefit of more savings? You can't decouple consumption from its economic benefit. You state COVID stopped everyone consuming, which is true, but those savings sat at the sideline and now are roaring to life where we are consuming again. Any reduction in consumption provides an economic benefit or savings. The only way to reduce our overall consumption is to take these savings and destroy them. You have to get that money out of the system.
Oh, it said
And then-
literally tear up our cash
Yeah,
or buy.
literally
what
tear up
the-
our cash or buy land and conserve it. You have to get that money out of the system. Otherwise, it goes back in and uses more materials and energy. We have to recognize this. If people would just realize that it's people driving all those cars, eating all that fish, living in all those houses, using all that electricity, contributing to all that sprawl, wearing all those clothes, buying all those electronics, releasing all that carbon, producing all that garbage and waste. This is the core issue, unsustainable population growth. So I guess my response to that is that, well, the first thing I guess I'd say is that I have a chapter in the book about specifically this issue of savings and money and the money problem. And Terry's exactly right. I mean, if we, at an individual level, if I personally reduce my consumption of certain things, then I accumulate savings. It's very difficult to do anything with those savings that's going to be beneficial in terms of either I spend it on some other products or services or experiences. I put it in the bank and the bank invests it for me in the consumer economy. I put it in investments myself, the same kind of effect happens. So that's the problem I think that Terry's describing here. And as I say, I've got a chapter on it in the book, but my point is that at the individual level, that's true. But if you act to make changes so that the system as a whole reduces consumption, if we actually work to create a lower consuming economy and society, then it ceases to be true. So if we wind it back, then we end up with a system where, for example, in Japan, we've seen no economic growth for almost 30 years, really. And there you see a dramatic change in the way people consume from, say, the peak of their bubble economy in the 1980s to today. So, some people now refer to Japan as the first post-luxury economy because there's so little luxury purchasing going on there at this point. So change the system rather than laying this on individuals is a really critical point within that question. The other point I'd make is that while it's true that that it is people driving all the cars, eating the fish, so on and so forth, that's only part of the story, right? It's really a very small number of people that are driving consumption globally. I mean, it's a very small slice of people that are consuming at a rate that is radically higher than most other people on the planet. And yet it is that very small group of people that is consuming so heavily that is creating a global aspiration towards that lifestyle. So those of us in nations like the United States, Canada, where I live, Western Europe, we have a tremendous responsibility to address the scale of our consumption and create, I think the kind of lifestyle that Dan was talking about, a kind of alternative that provides meaning and satisfaction to life without requiring this enormous amount of consumption to, as an essential part of that happiness.
Mhm.
We have to get busy creating that lower consuming yet meaningful lifestyle so that we don't stand out as this aspiration that the rest of the
Mhm.
world wants to reach towards.
Mhm.
Thank you. Do you want to ask each other questions, or I have another question for really all of us to sort of bring all of this together too. And that is about 2 weeks ago, maybe, in response to the war in Ukraine, Secretary General Guterres pleaded with the world to consume less, cut back on our consumption. I mean, I think he was referring to fossil fuels mostly, not other things,
Mhm.
but maybe he was referring to more than fossil fuels. But and what happened in the United States was that Biden released more fossil fuels. He's
Yeah.
in New York State, we are lowering the gas tax so that
Mhm.
people can pay for more gasoline, and will end up probably buying more gasoline so that they can drive more. We don't know what it means to conserve anymore. And how do we how do we move toward, in this country, we don't really understand the whole concept of conservation.
Mhm.
Kathy, there's another question here that might be interesting. Some of you may know, this is from Lucy. There are a lot of buy nothing groups around that practice the free exchange of goods that people no longer need in their household. So people aren't
Mhm.
buying anything. And I've heard of these groups are becoming more and more popular,
Mhm.
especially with babies, for example. You need so many things. And once they
Mhm.
grow up, you don't need them anymore. Can I ask a question, Kathy?
Oh.
I'm wondering about some of Daniel Wildcat's, his 3 points. Do you have a suggestion on how to get started, even on the first one? to
Yeah,
see
I think,
what his growth is?
and I'd like to, again, get Nita and JB's response to this. I think, so first of all, when we talk about military, militarization, I mean, that is big scale bureaucratization. I mean, I guess militaries are the embodiment of what, a bureaucracy is, very hierarchically organized and everything. And by the way, that's why they've been so, in some respects, been more efficient than other people in sort of looking at, how to reduce their cost in the face of climate change, impacts. They're really, instrumentalizing calculations about, how do they do that if the sea level rises? And this has real direct impacts on them. What I want to suggest is the way to address this is at the other end of the continuum, is that you start small. I mean, if this kind of sounds like E.F. Schumacher, I guess maybe there's a little bit of that in indigenous traditions. You start with a community. That community might be, ideally, you share a specific geography, a place, and you build a sense of community so that, first of all, you can build trust and, relationships progress at the speed of trust. And I'd go back to what I say. I think even one of the problems we have with building communities today is we have created a fearful, distrustful world. People live in fear, and they're distrustful. And I think this is kind of what militarization is, kind of a function of living in that Hobbesian, world. And I think that's something that we have to figure out the counterpoint. So I would say the first way to do it is find a community that you can be a part of, that you can feel trust, that you can begin to make small changes. And it's a platitude, but there's a reason sometimes, platitudes, okay, we dismiss platitudes, but sometimes they're platitudes for a reason. When one is, nothing sells like success. If you start doing something well and people see it and they go like, wow, why can't I do that? I think we've just got to have all of these little explorations of living differently in meaningful relationships, building trust. And yeah, we can start to really help each other out and live a richer life for it.
Thank you.
But Nita, would you like to respond to any of this?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
I think,
Please.
when Daniel said Hobbes, I was writing down as you were saying that what he says, which is life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
And he talks about a fear of man against man,
Yeah.
a fear of all against all. And this really does go to both the understanding of our place in nature, which you can also find in the Bible as, dominion,
Mhm.
but it's our understanding not just of our place in nature, but of human nature,
Mhm.
and that we can't trust others. And so I think that it does go to what you were saying about fear. Now, the way I understand fear is on a couple different levels. On one level, it's the institutionalization of fear is the U.S. military, is everyone's military. It's the
Mhm.
institutionalization of interpersonal and interstate fear, but that can unintentionally ratchet up fear rather than
Mhm.
diminish it. At a second level, I see it as driving our consumption, and the military is meant to, make sure that we have access to that stuff that makes that consumption possible at the price that we want. And we could have access to all that stuff, but we'd have to pay more for it.
Mhm.
And then at the third level, I see fear working as essentially in a biological way in humans, where the place that fear resides in our bodies is essentially in the amygdala, and its relationship to the prefrontal cortex is we stop thinking clearly, we sort of shut down, and all the rest of those processes take
Yeah.
hold, like our stomachs stop digesting food and we're get ready to fight or run or freeze, but we stop thinking. And so essentially at a political level, we've stopped thinking as well. And we're on these sort of automatic processes where we think that the military is a solution to most of our problems. So we think, first of all, that military force can work. And what we've seen actually is that military force is actually sometimes counterproductive or ineffective. But the militarist and the militarist beliefs are that military force is effective, and that it's controllable, and that there be no unintended side effects, and that the costs of using force are low, when the costs of using force are actually quite high, and the consequences extend beyond war
Yeah.
itself. The consequences ripple into the bodies of the people who are been fighting and who've been traumatized in a war situation, and they ripple out into the environment, into destruction. So every war that I'm familiar with destroys the environment, the natural environment, as well as the human relationships. So I think fear is at the root of it, but it's a story we tell ourselves about what we should be afraid of, and
Right.
how to respond to fear with preparedness and force.
I'm just reading the chat, and Nydia says, thank you for your presentations. A book that will be of interest to you by Sally Weintraub, the leading UK psychoanalyst for youth, is titled, The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, subtitled Neoliberal Exceptionalism and the Culture of Uncare. It sounds like it would be certainly applicable to what you're saying right now. And Elizabeth has an interesting suggestion that some of the books, including your books, of the three of you, be used as for book clubs to start discussions or within classroom situations. And then Judith Green says, my daughter helped found a time bank in the Boston area in which people put in time doing tasks for others and receive approximately equal time from others for their needs, whether house cleaning, tutoring, in stats. Haircuts, gardening, no money is exchanged. That's, bartering services. And there are other programs like that as well. But this one is in Northampton, Massachusetts. Thank you. Elizabeth says some colleges have first-year texts that all freshmen read to create community. And the books would be great for this, for opening discussion. But any other questions or discussions you want to have amongst yourselves?
I might jump in just on that to add a point on fear from the perspective of the consumer research I've done, because it's interesting that it's it ended up being a really essential part of Dan's talk, and then Neta had such a interesting perspective on that as well. One thing that I guess got into as I was working in the research for this book was how much of our consumption is actually driven, like personal and household consumption is driven by fear, and it's driven in a couple of ways. One is the classic keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon, which I think most of us associate with kind of status competition and even with greed. But it's actually a much more, even Torstein Veblen, who Dan quoted earlier, even he recognized that it wasn't driven primarily by those things, but rather by the fact that we are trying to maintain social dignity in society. And that's very different than being kind of greedy for or accumulative. If we see others with a great deal more than we have, we start to fear that our position in society is weakening and that we are losing a dignified place. And that's a very big driver of consumption. The other is that if you see a lot of people around you who have far more resources than you do, it just creates an actual basal insecurity, a fear that you may not have enough. And I had a really interesting conversation with a woman who had moved from Finland, which of course is quite an egalitarian society, and a lot of economic, a much narrower gap between rich and poor than the United States. She moved from Finland to New York City to work, and she described the psychological effect of that as being one of fear and anxiety. And one of the things that had happened to her is that she had not seen poverty, kind of street poverty of the type that she saw in New York City. She'd never been exposed to that previously. And living in the city of New York made her fear that if she kind of lost the game, then that's where she might end up. So she found herself actually buying goods to create a psychological buffer, as she described it, between herself and that worst case scenario in her eyes. And And then ultimately she moved back to Finland, and she said she felt all of that released because Finland has a much stronger social safety net. So yeah, I think we often don't recognize how powerful a driver fear is in so many ways in our society, and that it is actually to the purposes of the consumer economy to maintain that sense of fear.
One of the things that I've found interesting about crises is when there's a sort of distant crisis or an imminent crisis, sometimes I'll go to the store and get more food, right? And then on the other hand, when something really bad happens in my neighborhood, like really bad, we come together and we cooperate. And Rebecca Solnit's work, the writer who's looked at crises, environmental crises and other crises, has found that there's that tendency to cooperate. So humans have all of that. The question I have is, how can I foster that? Don't go buy more toilet paper or water for when my river floods and there's no more water. How can we foster that cooperative response? And it reminds me of what Daniel said about relatives. There's other ways to think about the distant other. And the militarized response on the border is put the wall up,
Right.
rather than see the person who's driven to move as a relative, as another human. And I think that the nationalism, the boundaries, doesn't help us see the community that we have. So I'm just thinking about my own impulses and then what we actually do.
Right. Yeah, I want to comment on that because that's a really good point. And here's how I would respond to that. So I think the challenge we have is that in this kind of global, and I'll be honest with you, a media-driven global environment that we're all a part of, and man, a lot of people have invested a lot of money in making sure we are electronically and digitally satellite-driven connected, And I think what's difficult is that those kinds of relationships we know are very shallow. And we know that the very tools that are supposed to connect us now become major technologies for falsehood, for untruth, for outright lies. I think what we've got to do is to start creating relationships or understanding relationships at a first level, in an immediate level, but in that kinship view, figure out how we can advance face-to-face relationships. I don't even know if this program exists anymore, but there was a time when there was some optimism about this. Remember the program People to People? And it supported the idea of young people from different nations coming and visiting a place and being a part of it. And then other students would go back to their place. And that's one way to counter this fear. If we can just build some really basic face-to-face relationships. And, I know that's a challenge. But I think the more we can do that, the better off we're going to be. As much as I'm thankful for this technology, I'm not quite ready to go the Kirkpatrick Sale route yet on technology. But I do think this tool we're using right now can be very, very destructive to the kind of community I'm talking about building.
By this tool, do you mean a webinar? or media in general?
Oh, this kind of media in general, you know, this digital media. I mean, you know, this is the first time I've ever, I don't even want to say I've met Neta or I've met JB. I'm looking at their faces on a screen. I don't know them. I'd like to know them, but the way I'd know them is if we had a weekend, we could just sit around and talk and eat and visit, and we could start to build a relationship. It's hard to do in this kind of media.
Sure.
And we see so many people who use this media in very horrible ways to make people think they have friends that really aren't their friends. And that worries me.
Well, I think that goes to the depression and anxiety that young people are feeling, that the lack of actual connection. You know, I have a 21-year-old daughter who basically sort of crawled into her bed when college ended dramatically in 2020. And then the connection that she has with her roommates is something that I think with some people creating a similar environment where they can talk about issues. And I think that that's part of what has made people healthier, sort of recover. But I think it goes to the sort of enervating nature of this technology, the passivity of it, and the sense that it's a substitute. I think my closest compatriots are still the people I have been arrested with, and or been at a protest with, or laying in the street with, and that, or taught with, right, as co-teachers in. So and those are the connections we need in a time, because I think one of the things that I've noticed in my 4 decades of activism is that it's the love that is sustaining, and yeah, it's harder to have that love in this anonymized way.
I'd like to say something. I'm not Catherine Schwartz. I did use her email to dial in. It's Diane Buxbaum. I grew up in Arizona. My grandfather did business with Native Americans, both in New Mexico and in Arizona. And I kind of am a little sad about the reference to this technology that we're using. I'm very grateful that I've had the opportunity to listen to these incredibly erudite people who have given me ideas. I would love to be able to meet in person. When I worked for EPA and I went to Washington and I sat next to people from different tribes talking about environmental issues, that was wonderful, but I can't do that now. And this technology enables me to hear and learn and take part in all of this. And I am very, very grateful for this. So, I mean, I don't want to come down so negative on this, but without this technology, we would not have had tonight. And meeting with all of you would not have been possible for me. I have certain disabilities and I can't do it. So I am so grateful to be here and to learn and to share. And I want to take, first of all, this moment to thank Catherine Schwartz for all the work that she has done. By the way, her name is up there all over the place because we all used her email, but Kathy set this up, and Kathy is an amazing activist who has such passion. She's just really an incredible person, and I want to say thank you to her for everything she has done for this. And I want to thank the speakers for having given me ideas. I think it's wonderful. And By the way, one word about the military, because working for EPA for 33 years, I had a lot to do with different military bases and their environmental efforts. The military, I have very mixed feelings about them. I feel protected in a way. I think it would be such an incredibly better world if none of us had to have them, but I don't know that the world will give us this yet. And given the fact that my husband's family, a lot of them who left Germany very fortunately in 39, they were very fortunate. Some of them didn't make it. So I must say, I am thankful for the military and for the feeling of security that sometimes they give me, even though they do some environmental things that are bad. But by God, you have to see the environmental programs on those bases, and those people have to toe the line. They don't have a lot of choices. So they set goals and often they meet them. So I just want to give a little plug. I am not a warmonger. I don't believe, well, anyway, that's all I want to say. Kathy, thank you very much. All right, I'm done.
I second
And
my second
thank
my
you, Diane.
appreciation for the organizers. Could I actually respond to that? Because I think it's
Sure.
really interesting, a really interesting comment in this sense. All of us probably have felt threatened and have had to defend ourselves at some point by somebody who meant ill. And until we live in a world where force isn't used in an aggressive manner, we should be prepared to defend ourselves and defend others who can't defend themselves. That's a responsibility. But much military force is not about defense. It's about offense. It's about not protecting individuals from aggression, but going to grab and make sure that you have access to the thing you think you need, like oil or gold or land. And in that sense, I'm not opposed to militaries that are constructed along the lines of self-defense. And the United States has adequate forces to defend its borders and to defend its allies. In fact, the United States has more than adequate forces for that. But what I think we could do is see a 50 to 70% reduction in the US military budget, and we'd still have adequate forces to defend ourselves and our neighbors. And what we have right now is nearly 800 billion anticipated in the US military budget for the coming fiscal year, and more than 750 billion for this fiscal year. And much of that is not about self-defense. So I appreciate the desire, in other words, to have a right-sized military that fulfills that mission, but think that we have a long way to go to get there.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask a political question of Neta? You spoke of the decision that came out of the United States that we do not, or the world does not have to declare the greenhouse gas emissions that's coming from their military. How should we require that this be changed? This is outrageous.
Right. So there's an organization that has begun to try to rectify that. And I went to the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow, where a number of people who work on these issues, as well as thousands of people, were talking about the necessity to count military emissions and to make that public. And this will probably be on the next Conference of Parties agenda. if you look at the Conflict Environment Observatory webpage, you can see how people are organizing to have all military emissions counted. And the military emissions that are counted right now are only those that occur within a state's borders. Those that are outside the borders, that known as bunker fuels, or from bunker fuels, or from multilateral operations, that is wars, are not counted, not necessarily and not necessarily included. So it's voluntary to include those in your declaration of emissions. So we have undercounted US emissions. All states who don't publicize and put into their statements of emissions are undercounting their emissions. And of course, the emissions from let's say the flying of planes and tanks that's just the tip of it, right? There are emissions from destruction, and there's emissions from explosions, and there's emissions from firefighting. When there is a fire, you use chemicals which are actually high in global warming potential. So then, of course, there's emissions for rebuilding, right? So when you decide that you're going to reconstruct a country and you use cement, concrete, then there are emissions from that production. And so, a war like the one in Ukraine or Afghanistan or Iraq, these are highly greenhouse gas intensive, and that intensive emissions continues in the rebuilding phase.
And does it also include the manufacture of these weapons or equipment, which then some of which we just sell to other countries?
Right. So what is counted right now? Military industrial emissions are part of the declarations of companies which declare their emissions. And that slide that I showed you of the top 3 arms manufacturers in the US, those are the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that they have declared. And I have then estimated, based on their declarations and the declarations of the top ones, what the whole supply chain emissions are. And if you put the supply chain's emissions next to the military's emissions itself, it's about the same size. So last year it was about 51 million metric tons of greenhouse gas from the military. If you look at the military industrial emissions, it's about the same. So you add them together, it's more than 100 million metric tons. Other countries have, with arms manufacturing facilities, have, of course, those emissions. Those emissions are part of national inventories. The military industrial emissions are part of national inventories, but you wouldn't necessarily know that they're military industrial. So Boeing, which has 44% of its revenue coming from arms sales, gives you their entire emissions profile. So then you have to do the math to figure out, well, what portion of that is possibly or likely military related. Whereas Lockheed Martin, with almost 90% of their production based in the military, for militaries, you can think it's almost all of their emissions are for military industrial purposes.
Kathy? Kathy?
Yes.
I've just been thinking from time to time in my life about why we don't have a Department of Peace. I think the question of fear and how that has come up in different places in this evening's presentations, affecting consumerism, causing us to alienate from one another and so forth. And it feels to me like the military only exacerbates fear, because the aspect of retaliation and physically hurting people is there. And of course, that's going to cause fear. And I just have in my imagination, I always think that it is possible to one day live or have a world where we don't have the need for military, where the kind of love, most every religion that I know involves loving thy neighbor, treat others as you would have them do unto you. In Islam, it's a sin not to give anybody a glass of water who asks for it. If you look at any of the world's religions and the indigenous, looking at the plants, the animals, the land, the air, the water as relatives, it's the same thing. So if we were to really be able to successfully achieve that level of being in the world, within our communities, with each other, to me, that would be the best possible thing that could ever happen. And I think, as was suggested by Dr. Wildcat, that if to just start to do it in our own communities, little by little, trade with each other so we don't have to buy stuff, set something up in our own communities that we actually can do this. We can do it and truly love, truly forgive, truly seek to understand. There's an indigenous saying, I don't know if it's indigenous or not, I've always heard that it was, never judge a person until you've walked a mile in their moccasins. And is that truly indigenous, Dr. Wildcat? I don't know if
I think that's one of those things that's universal.
Okay.
That.
Right. And I think it's not always easy. I can attest to it. But if each of us live these values with one another, that helps create it. And that's just kind of thought I'd like to share with you all.
But there is one more question in the chat, and I know we have to finish because it's probably well over what we thought we were going to.
8:57.
Yeah, but Sam asks, why won't you mention anything about population or overpopulation? And I just want to sort of bring it to our discussion and say that there are 7.9 billion people on the planet, all at this point, I think, competing with one another for resources, which is also contributing to wars and migrations and also competing for money on the planet, which is probably pretty much the same thing as fuel and all these resources. And Sam asks, no one really, well, it did come up, but Sam asked the question about population on the planet, and I do think it's contributing to this competition and fear also of one another to grab resources. So if anybody wants to address that, and we shouldn't end in such a negative, on a negative note, but it's I think it's real, and Sam asked the question. I didn't want to.
Yeah, I'll give a short response. I think overpopulation is an issue that's driven by global poverty. It's driven by the incredible unequal distribution of wealth on this planet. And so if you live in Central Africa, in a very poor, drought-stricken country, your only social security is your children. And human population demographers have documented this for years. They don't just have children because they want to have, 10 kids. They realize that a large number of their children will die in infancy from hunger, from starvation, from disease. I think the best way to address overpopulation is to address the global unequal, very unequal distribution of wealth and income.
Yay.
I guess I could add to that. I think what Daniel says is pretty pretty strongly supported by quite a bit of research at this point, that population is something that we kind of know the solution to, and it is to create, to build social security for all people around the world, and to empower women. And if you do those two things, then what we see is that population growth slows down. The reason that I don't focus on, I mean, population is definitely a really serious issue when it comes to consumption. There's the old, I think it's what must be 40 or 50-year-old formula, which is population plus affluence plus technology equals impact, right? Or population might be a multiplier, so I can't recall at the moment. But affluence is the power to consume. And the thing is that not each of those parts of the equation are equal. So right now, what we're starting to see is more and more evidence that the affluence part is actually the greatest problem. It isn't so much population anymore. Population up until about the year 2000 was the biggest driver of environmental problems. Affluence now seems to be that driver. And I gave some examples earlier about how that works, but I actually went looking at one point. I was like, well, there must be environmental problems that are very clearly driven, overwhelmingly by population. And one that I thought would be an example was fresh water. So I thought, naturally the depletion of fresh water is going to occur because there is too large a population trying to draw on that fresh water for its use. But it turns out that in a lot of the most water-stressed parts of the world, that's not the primary driver. The primary driver is, for example, the growing of cotton to produce clothing for consumers far away from the people who are associated with that water base. So, it will be very little help to us to solve the growth of population and replace it with the endless, the perpetual growth of consumption by all the remaining people. Because, as I said earlier, consumption can substitute for population. If we are consuming in the wealthy countries 13 times as much as the people in the poorer countries, then, as I said, our family of 4 is the equivalent of 52 people in one of those countries. We embody population growth in our consumption. So that's why I'm turning my focus to affluence and to consumption. That isn't to say that population is a non-issue, and there are certainly lots of people who are talking about population, and I'd recommend Alan Weissman's book, where he took a look at overpopulation, and I think make some really, really important points about it. But I've turned my focus towards consumption and affluence.
I would just add one, I guess almost an anecdote. When societies become more affluent, as let's say China has in the last several decades, we see that they change their consumption patterns, and they start consuming in the same ways that people in the West are consuming, and that includes eating meat in much greater proportion. So that has this kind of ripple effect where grain is now feeding these animals, which could have been feeding people. And then there are also, sadly, these animals, these ruminant animals, are emitting methane. So if we had a sort of lower on the food chain model, which some of these societies did have before they became affluent and sort of deciding that that meant you had to eat more meat, then we would have fewer consequences of this large population. So I'm entirely in agreement that it's our choices often more than our number.
Well, thank you so much. I think I covered I think I covered all the questions that came up, and I know we're way over time, but thank you a million to our wonderful speakers, and thank you a million to all who who attended. And, you know, let's continue this conversation and action as well. Any ideas that derived from our speakers and from some of the notes in the chat, which I'm assuming that people saw. And I also left my email address in the chat. And so if anybody wants to continue discussion with me and with our committee, you know, please reach out to me as well. So thank you a million to the three of you. This has been enlightening and important and really important. So thank you. Thank you. And we need the Department of Homeland Maturity and maybe also the Department of Homeland Humility.
Department of
God.
Peace. Don't forget the Department of Peace.
Very,
Okay.
very important. Department of
Yes,
Peace.
thank you. Yes.
Thank you for this opportunity to meet all of you in this.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're
for-
gonna be looking for your book.
Thank you.
And good luck in your move. I guess you're moving to Oxford.
Yep. I'll be hanging out on the Thames.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Now.
Bye.